Hello, everybody. This is Tim Cusick with WKO4. I'm only going to do a quick introduction today. We have Dr. Andrew Coggin on today. Andy's going to be talking about running with power. Uh, Obviously, this is a new science and something new to the market. So, there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions. Hopefully, Andy can give you just a good intro and overview and some insight about this kind of new tracking metric, and show you a little bit of his findings and insights and answer some questions. So if I can here, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andy, and if you need anything, you just let me know.
All right, thanks, Tim.
I just need to change presenters to be you. Should allow you to just give permission and we'll see your screen. We now see your screen.
All right, well, again, fantastic. Thanks, Tim, and hello to everyone out there listening in, either live or when this gets shared via a recording. As Tim indicated, this is really early days when it comes to running power. And so what I really wanted to do is more just introduce the topic, talk about some of the I don't know if you'd call them hurdles or things you might have to deal with in order to try and utilize WKO4 to analyze your running power data. I was then going to show some of the default simpler charts and expressions. Then I was going to show some ones that I've been working on. And then finally, I may spend a moment or two poking around trying to create an expression or two. There is the chat box, the question box, so I'm hoping to leave lots of time and get lots of questions because we need to know from the people out there who might be using the software as well as the devices that are starting to appear on the market, how we could best serve your needs. Anyway, so if you're looking at my screen, you can see I've got WKO4 up and running. And just to have a data set to work with, I took all of my cycling and I've actually started running a little bit with the Stride Power Meter, or as Dr. Steve McGregor described it probably more aptly, the portable gait lab a little bit. I took all of the data for 2016, both running and cycling, and I dumped it into a new athlete here called Running Webinar. So you can see that I have had 91 workouts, 66 hours to date, and because these are both running and cycling files, WKO4 is smart enough to know that, and therefore I've got these push buttons up at the top where I can select all of the files, the little chain link for the cycling only data, or for the little foot for the little running only files. So try to turn running on. We have all off, cycling off, running on. Here we go. So now you can see I went from 91 files for the year down to 16, and I went from 66 hours just down to about 10 hours, or 110 kilometers. So I've been able to use the push buttons up here in order to filter the data down just to the running results that are available. Now, we're working here at the athlete level. So you have this athlete details box, and your options here for the settings for the different things. Some of them are more cycling specific, and therefore don't really apply all that much. For example, I don't know if we have a threshold cadence while running, although I guess there is a stride rate associated with running at your threshold when running on flat ground, so you could set that. There is a threshold run pace you could set. Of course, you have maximum heart rates. These would apply as well. Although one of the issues becomes, how do you track sport-specific maximum heart rates? Highest heart rate I've seen this year cycling is like 168 or 169. I haven't pushed myself that high or that hard while running 155, so which number do I enter? You do have a threshold run pace you can enter, and we're talking about running with power, so this is actually relevant. a threshold power that you can track as well that would apply, and your weight, of course. When it comes to the training levels, we've got a lot of heart rate levels, but this webinar is about running with power or running with pace index. So you can use the pace zone index, and I don't remember who came up with these, but these are also available on Training Peaks as I recall. You can use Joe Friel's pace levels if you want to say classify your training sessions that way. There are the heart rate ones. One caveat I would mention here is that while physiologically running and cycling are both endurance sports and the same general principles apply, when you really get down to brass tacks, what might be optimal in one situation isn't necessarily optimal for the other. For example, consider the classic power levels in which there are 7 going from recovery all the way up to sprinting. And then you start thinking about that in terms of running, and do you really need to define a really slow recovery run pace? Most runners don't run that slowly relative to their threshold. They might call an easier run a recovery run, but true recovery for a runner would be to go for a walk or sit on the couch. So do you even need a zone 1? Similarly, if you're dealing with endurance athletes, endurance runners, do they ever really sprint? If you're a mass start cyclist, obviously you have to sprint at various times. But endurance runners tend to be endurance focused, and sprint runners tend to be sprint focused, and not that often do they meet in the middle. So do we really need a level 7 for running? So these are the kinds of things that we're wrestling with Stride, with the team there, with Dr. McGregor, trying to come up with the simplest system because you don't want to overcomplicate things. But physiologically, at least, you could use the classic cog and power levels and look at distributions, histograms, etc. You could, in theory, also use the new eye levels, but I'll show you later on why that may not work out all that well. So now that we've talked about a little bit about how to filter the data and look and make sure we're focusing on just our running files, let's take a look at some of the default charts that are available. There is a weekly summary report specifically for running. Covers the distance, how much you climb up and down. It says RTSS here, but since I actually have power data, this is actually TSS based on the power. And the reason these are so low is when I first started, it was just, a few little treadmill runs and that kind of thing. An average intensity factor, normalized graded pace, etc. So that's available as a default chart. If you want to do simple things, you can look at, what's your average distance per week here. So I'm trying to build up my running, and then, my hip is complaining, so it hasn't been working out all that well. But I got up to 31 kilometers that week. And I have not explored all of the default charts that work for running, but one of the things you can do if you want to try and add additional charts is simply use that as a search term. And find all of the charts that have been tagged running. And you can see there's some here that I've created myself. But if we just go down, there's also an awful lot of default charts that have been included. Just see if there's anything. Here's a monthly summary comparable to that weekly summary I was showing you. Plan versus actual running. This might be an interesting one. Oops, that was time in zones. Time in zones in Joe Friel's pace zones. Okay, that's cool. The reason that worked out was that you scroll all the way down here, it's like I double click and it ends up jumping the scroll, and I missed the chart that I was looking for, so I get ahead of myself. One click to select that one, and then a second click. Here's my average normalized graded pace, which again is Dr. McGregor's correlate to normalized power, which tries to take into consideration variations in terrain in order to adjust the pace for that, as well as distance. So that's another way of trying to look to make sure you're dealing specifically with running data. Not only the push buttons up here, but you can also search for charts that have been tagged run. And then to give another example of how things work in order to keep your running and cycling and swimming data kind of filtered or separate when you want it to be, let's take a look at the expression here for RTSS. So here it is simply summing it by week, but there's this if statement. If sport equals run, then TSS. So that is another level of filtering. So even if I selected all of my data over here, this expression would select just the running files in order to calculate TSS. And TSS in this case is sort of a generic word. As Tim was explaining to me right before we started, there's a hierarchy. If power data are available, it's calculated from power. If not, it then goes down the pecking order to RTSS would be for running, then it filters down. I think heart rate TSS might be like your next choice down the line, etc. But since I have power data, this is actually based on my running power measurements. So different ways of filtering the push buttons. Searching for charts that have already been tagged as being run specific, as well as using an if sport equals as a filter within your own expressions, or to customize charts that, for example, maybe there's a cycling chart that inspires you. And I just got a message about using new hardware. I bumped my headphones. So, but you do seem to be still hearing me, so I'll keep going. So then, if you see there's a cycling chart and you want to adapt it from running, you could use the if sport equals run qualifier and modify expressions that way. Now let's drill down to the workout level. And you'll see how, because I've already, let me take that out of there. So while at the athlete level, I can use the push buttons to select all workouts, just cycling, just running, etc. When you come down to the workout level, this is really just, on the left-hand Explorer, this is really just a sequential list of all my workouts. So you can see there's both a mixture of running and cycling in there. So in that case, you could just filter those by typing in run, and now I've selected only the running workouts to look at. And we've said this before, but if there's a box like this in WKO4 anywhere, you can type text in it and do searches. And if you hover over anything and it lights up, it's clickable. And I just realized, to backtrack here, while we can filter data within charts, either using the push buttons or the expressions, the hero metrics themselves end up being based for now just on your cycling data. So that's something that would be nice in the future to be able to either customize, or I think we've talked about tagging an athlete or defining an athlete as primarily a runner, in which case this would be run-based data, or primarily a cyclist, be cycling data. So let's say, though, because of the way data are recorded these days, and Stride has been, it's a overused term, but it's been disruptive technology. they said, we're going to calculate power from running, and we're going to use ANT Plus as well as Bluetooth to broadcast to their own app running on a smartphone. But they're going to use ANT Plus, and they're going to stick the running power data into the ANT Plus specifications where cycling power data normally goes. And they're also then, putting the other running specific metrics that I'll talk about into that ANT Plus file. And then you run into the problem that the manufacturers who are producing all the various watches out there, running watches and recording devices, they aren't prepared to deal with running power. So at the present time, you have to learn some various workarounds, such as you pair your Stride running power meter, and I assume this is true as well with the RPM2, although I've had no experience with it, as if it is a bike power meter. So I have a Garmin 920 XT watch on my wrist here, which has these various profiles, but when I go out running, it thinks I'm cycling, because that's the only way I can see the power data in real time. Well, that's all well and good. You can get, pace from the GPS, you can get your power, you can get your cadence or stride rate, etc. But what you lose in the process are the running specific metrics. Fortunately, Stride recently enabled their own internal recording. So you set the chest strap device that includes the built-in heart rate monitor to record data internally, and you don't necessarily get to see vertical oscillation and stance time while you're out running at the same time you're seeing power, but you do have access to it after the fact by merging the watch data with the internally recorded data. There is one watch out on the market by Sun2, might be the Ambit 3, that will actually allow you to display on your wrist in real time both running power and the other running metrics. But I have not used it. I can't vouch that's the exact model, and I do know that Stride has been making lots of requests, but the manufacturers aren't necessarily catching up. And in fact, Sun2, I understand it was really just by accident that they ended up supporting it in their new watch without necessarily planning to. The upshot of all of this is that in porting data around, Garmin Connect, for example, I download my Garmin watch to Garmin Connect. It thinks it's running, it thinks it's cycling data. I have to reclassify it as running data. That's then, pulled over to Stride's Power Center, where it's merged with my directly uploaded via their phone app data that was internally recorded. Sometimes workouts get misclassified. So what is actually a run still gets called a bike workout. So within WKO4, if you end up importing a .fit file that was a run and it thinks it's cycling, hey, look, see how this lights up? So you could, within WKO4, reclassify things. So another consideration about, how to manage your data really within WKO4. All right, so with that in mind, let's take a look at a workout. Let's start first with some default charts. And one thing to realize is that if you're at the athlete level and you ask to, call up a new chart, it's only going to show you the athlete level charts, because a workout level chart doesn't work at the athlete level, and an athlete level chart doesn't work at the workout level. So if you don't see your chart that you're looking for, you have to think for a minute and say, oh wait, was that an athlete level chart? Was that a workout level chart? And make sure you're at the right level while you're searching your chart library. So here, using that same trick though, and searching for charts that have been tagged run, you can see I've got a bunch of them, and I don't know why I started labeling with my name. I should just tag them in the tags with my name. It would be the same thing. But I do kind of like seeing that, because I know that this is something I made or modified, whereas this is something that came from somebody else. But let's just take a look. Here we have a running workout review report. So it gives me my duration moving. Oh, my total duration, the duration I was moving, how many meters I climbed, how many meters I descended. Of course, it's barometric pressure based, so if there's a slight drift in barometric pressure while you're out running, those two don't necessarily agree, even though I started and finished my run in the exact same place. And my average normalized graded pace, my max pace, minutes per kilometer, average heart rate, max heart rate, etc. So fairly simple stuff, but you have to start with the basics at some point. And what I'm really just trying to do is show you how you find things that would be running related. And I'm actually exploring a little bit myself here because I haven't paid a huge amount of attention to the various default running stuff. Here's a running heart rate review chart. Okay, a pretty simple chart. So we have heart rate and then elevation of my run in the background. One of the things I was struck by when I started running in my neighborhood, if you're feeling peppy on the bike, there's no need for a small chain ring. You could get up all the hills around here, just big ring it in the immediate vicinity. Now, if you go, out of my neighborhood and out into St. Louis County and beyond, there are some nice 5-minute climbs. But at least in the immediate vicinity, it's really pretty flat from a cyclist perspective. And then I started running, and I realized when it's flat to a cyclist, where you have gears and a mechanical device to help you, it's not flat for a runner. So there's actually a fair bit of elevation change that you have to haul your behind up and down. So that's the elevation profile in the background. What we have here is heart rate, but then we also have power to heart rate ratio. Now you can, type out the whole expression yourself, but in fact there is an alias for power to heart rate ratio that saves you a little bit of work. And then this is, again, Joe Friel's efficiency factor, which I'm trying to remember how that's defined, but it's related to power to pace, as I recall. All right, so now let's talk about some more esoteric kinds of things, or some more, I think, kind of interesting things. Let me clean this up a little bit here. Let's just return them to the library that I checked them out from. And go to this running dashboard. So dashboards are really kind of cool. This is a newer innovation, right? So that you can have multiple salt charts visible at the same time. But to make them a little bit bigger, I'm going to hide my right-hand and left-hand explorers. And I have a confession to make. If Tim's listening, and he's going to chuckle in the background. When the dashboard idea first was completed, I made a couple dashboards, and then I was like, it doesn't excite me too much. It's just as easy for me to have them all open and click along, the tabs at the top. Plus, I thought, well, logically, I'd want to just double click on this and have it expand the whole way. And it doesn't work that way. I don't like having to go to the drop-down box and say open chart in tab. And then I was watching Tim, and lo and behold, look, the chart title lights up. What does that mean? It's clickable. So all I needed to do was move my cursor, and I would have been able to get instant access. So once I discovered that, I'm like, man, I'm an idiot. I don't even know how the program works. And then I started saying, what would be really cool is if this cursor here was linked across all of the live charts. And I finished that email, and I said something along the lines of course, this is probably something Kevin's already thought of and implemented, and I just hadn't noticed yet. And guess what? Yep, he had. So you can see as I navigate my way around on this my version of the horizontal running chart to 33:45, the cursor also jumps on the other three charts in the dashboard to 33 minutes and 45 seconds. So now dashboards are really cool. I mean, especially if you have a big monitor. I'm sitting here working on just a laptop, but if you had a really big monitor, it's fantastic because you can display the same data as a function of time on the x-axis, but you don't have to have 15 different data series plotted overlapping each other and getting really messy. Instead, you have 3 or 4 data series here, 3 or 4 data series here, but you can still relate the two. It's like, okay, as I'm running up this hill here and pushing the power for 1 minute, I can also look down below and say, well, what's happening to my vertical oscillation at the same time? So, yeah, big monitor is really tempting now. So these are the things that I've stuck on my dashboard so far, and these are all really just experimental in the sense. So I don't know exactly what I want to focus on at the present time. So I've just been exploring with different things. And I just noticed there are some questions queuing up here, so I will make sure to leave time at the end. So just be patient, right? We're not ignoring you. So let's take a look at the first one here. This is just my version of the horizontal running chart, and I don't really recall exactly what I might have changed from the standard one. But I've got elevation in the background, I've got power, I've got my pace in minutes per kilometer because I'm a SI units kind of guy. I've got my heart rate, and I've got my elevation. And if I had this linked at one point to a map, but I know where I ran, but you could have it linked to the map and see exactly where the run took place. And you would see here the points where, I'd walk maybe at a couple lights for a little bit, jogging in place, standing in place, that kind of thing before I could get going again. The second chart on my dashboard that I've created is now moving from something here that is, pretty the basic level, and might be of interest even if you didn't have power for running. If you just had a GPS watch or a foot pod or something like that, you could have heart rate, you could have pace, you could have elevation, etc. You just wouldn't have power. But the second one here is now getting sort of specific to running power, and I've called it the running effectiveness chart. The term effectiveness is one that I came up with or coined out of necessity. In the field of exercise physiology, we use the term efficiency to mean thermodynamic efficiency. That is the ratio of energy out to energy in times 100%. And you can measure that on a cycloergometer. You can measure somebody's mechanical power output based on the cycloergometer or the power meter on your bicycle. And you can measure their metabolic power production or power release, really, using a metabolic cart to determine their VO2 and respiratory exchange ratio. The ratio of those two is their mechanical efficiency or their thermodynamic efficiency, and physically it means the exact same thing as if you talked about the efficiency of an electric motor, for example. Something that if you're building, if you're a Tesla or a Chevy engineer, building the Chevy Volt or the Chevy Bolt or one of the Tesla cars, you would really need to know the efficiency of your electric motors because that's going to dictate, how big of a battery you need and how far you're going to be able to travel with a given charge, etc. Because until now there hasn't been much focus on power in running. Instead, in the field of exercise physiology, people have used speed or pace as a poor man's substitute and refer to the ratio of VO2 to pace as your running economy. So a more economical runner consumes less oxygen while running at a particular pace. So the word efficiency is already used. It's the ratio of mechanical power to metabolic power. The word economy is already used. It's the ratio of speed to oxygen uptake or metabolic rate. Well, what is the ratio of speed to power while running? There's no word for it, at least that I could find in the scientific literature. So a few people were calling it efficiency, but that, I'm pedantic to the core, so I'd say no, that's not the correct use of the terminology. And so I initially was saying we need to talk about your running efficacy, and that didn't stick all that well, but effectiveness did stick pretty well. And in fact, there is some variation between individuals in terms of how much speed they get out of a particular power output while running, and it can change over time. So this chart is set up to just really focus on that. Again, I've got elevation in the background as gray just for reference purposes. I've got the power here in yellow. I've got my speed in meters per second in blue, and then the hot pink is my running effectiveness. The average person, it's about the units end up really strange by the time you work it all the way through. If it's normalized to body mass, the units are actually kilograms per Newton. But that's a minor detail. You're really just thinking about the ratio of speed to power. The average person, it's usually around 1. It varies a little bit from one person to another, but you can see, at least at this moment, my value is less than 1. But you can also see, let's try hiding power and hiding speed, and just look at my running effectiveness. Well, the ratio of speed to power, look, here's a downhill. Well, I'm running downhill, so of course I go faster, right? And I'm not producing as much power. I'm benefiting from gravity, and so my running effectiveness appears to go up. And then when you have to climb a hill, not really obvious uphills here, maybe along here. This is a steady drag coming up, and you can see my running effectiveness is on the low side. So obviously your ratio of speed to power will vary depending upon the terrain, which is why I have elevation here in the background. The other thing that happens, though, is if you have to stop and walk along the way, you might continue to kind of bounce in place. The stride uses a separate algorithm to calculate walking power. So it'll continue to report a power output, but the GPS satellites see me as not moving at all, right? Because I'm just kind of pacing back and forth in a little 2-foot square kind of thing. So my measured speed or pace drops to 0, and then your effectiveness goes to 0. Which leads me to down here, I have a summary report to go with this, which just averages over the entire workout, with one little caveat, and that is I wanted to look at only the power output when I was actually running. Now that's kind of looking at excluding all of the zero power data from your cycling data. So it's cheating in that regard. There is a difference, however, and that is runners spend, unless you live in a really urban area, they spend a lot less time, quote unquote, coasting versus cyclists. And we'll see later there's some more advanced calculations that I'm doing that if you don't exclude the walking stuff, then the mean values get really distorted. So I'm not necessarily saying that you should do this. Philosophically, I'm not sure if it's ideal, but for other purposes and other expressions, I set it up this way. So I was going to show you just how you could filter. And notice speed here is in kilometers per hour because I've selected the SI system, so I have to multiply by 1,000 to get meters per hour and divide by 3,600 to get meters per second, so speed divided by 3.6 is meters per second. And then finally here is the, again, it's the ratio of speed to power for periods that I was going more than 1.5 meters per second, which is about typical transition from walk to run and vice versa. All right, so let's, again, clean these up a little bit. Go back to the dashboard. Now here's one I've called running dynamics. And the reason I did that is because that's what Garmin calls these things. That is, if you have a foot pod or whatever, you can get ground contact time, or what Garmin calls stance time. And because Garmin owns ANT Plus and they've popularized the .fit file format, stance time has started to catch on more in the athletic world, even though in the scientific literature it would probably be ground contact time. But that's only worth knowing in the sense of it's stance time that you need to remember if you are going to do an expression using it. So this chart is really just set up to display the things that you could get from any of the various running devices out there, not just the stride. But you can see here's my step rate or stride rate, and then the times that I was standing around. The time I spend on the ground, of course, if you're running uphill, it's hard to fly through the air very much. And if you're running downhill, you tend to fly through the air a bit more, kind of thing. My vertical oscillation, so this is how much the stride is sensing that my center of mass goes up and down with every single stride. One thing that's worth knowing if you want to understand running biomechanics, and I'm trying to quickly get up to speed, much of this vertical oscillation actually occurs while your foot is on the ground. So, you go to take your first running stride, you launch yourself into the air because you're flying through the air without your feet in contact to the ground. You're going to follow a parabolic flight path. Then your foot comes back down, hits the ground. The early portion of that ground contact time, some people have referred to as the crash phase. So now you're actually absorbing a bunch of shock. Then your muscles fire. You start to, and you get recoil of the series elastic elements, and now you start to lift your center of mass back up again, and eventually you lose contact with the ground and fly through the air again. So much of the vertical oscillation actually occurs during that crash phase when your foot is in contact with the ground, and less of it actually occurs between flying through the air. And then finally, I'm going to work my way back around here to the fanciest one of all. The notion of running power, the first attempt to calculate the power output of runners was probably by Fenn in the 1930s. There's a few papers by an Italian by the name of Kavanaugh, not Peter Kavanaugh, but a different Kavanaugh, in which case they use force plate data to calculate power. There's some dispute as to what does running power actually mean. Even some people say that runners don't produce power, which I think is a sort of a misconception. I mean, power is just a physical concept, the product of work time distance divided by time, or force times speed. And there's no question that runners move through space and they produce forces. So of course there's a power output. I think the real question is, what is the significance of that number? What you would really want to know is what's driving metabolic, physiological responses that underlie performance and track something that would give you insight in modified and that kind of thing. And power, might be a indirect surrogate for something that is really more causal. But be that as it may, we have now various devices out there that offer power data. But there are other things you can do with this kind of data. So here is my attempt to take advantage of what might be better described as the gate lab capabilities of the stride. And so what I've done is I've implemented a spring on a mass biomechanical model where the human body is modeled as if you're simply a point mass. All of your mass is concentrated to an infinitely small point, some distance off the ground, and it's suspended by a spring. And as you run, what you really do is you bounce along. So, the spring is compressed on impact. You then, tip forward. The spring extends. It launches you forward. While you're in the air, you rotate that spring to where it's now out in front of you. It hits the ground. It's compressed. Your center of mass travels over the contact point. The spring expands, etc. So this has been a very popular model of upright bipedal locomotion, that is, walking and running, in the biomechanics literature for quite some period of time. And while it's clearly an oversimplification, it nonetheless does provide us some insights. It typically requires a force plate to obtain that data, but here I've implemented a model that can be done just using some of the data that's available from this device. And so what I'm calculating here is duty factor, or duty cycle, would really be the percent of time that you spend with your foot on the ground. Flight time, I've calculated, so that's how much time I spend in the air. F max would be your maximum ground reaction force during the crash phase. And you can see these spikes over here are the points where I had to stop running and start walking, which kind of screws up the calculations. So this is why I implemented that filtering when I was doing the averages. I haven't filtered these calculations. Or F max, this case expressed relative to my body mass, so how many G's. So I hit the ground with about 2 G's of force with every stride. And then finally, this is K apparent. That is, for a spring that is not compressed or stretched beyond its limits, there's a linear relationship between the force that needs to be applied and how much it stretches or is compressed. And that depends upon just how stiff the spring is, the K value. It's of interest here because there's some evidence in the literature that the most economical runners are those with the most appropriately stiff springs. And that is, if you are a cyclist like me going out there trying to run, the series elastic elements, all of the collagen, my tendons, and my fascia and that kind of thing isn't highly developed, and a lot of energy is absorbed, but it isn't returned, and therefore I have to use metabolic energy in order to run. Whereas if you are a more accomplished, more experienced runner, maybe you've been doing your plyometrics, you recycle more of the energy while you're running, and therefore you're able to run at the same pace while using less metabolic energy. I know historically, from having done treadmill tests on myself with the metabolic cart, that I use about 40% more oxygen at any given running speed compared to an untrained person. And elite economical distance runners might be 10 to maybe even 20% better than the average untrained person. So if you compared me to an elite distance runner, I'm having to use up huge amounts of energy to travel at the same speed, which explains why I'm a really lousy runner compared to my cycling ability. The flip side is that it means I get to eat, 40% more, right? The old rule of thumb, 100 calories per mile, that doesn't apply for me. For me, it's more like 140 calories a mile. So there's got to be an upside somewhere. Anyway, I was interested in trying to calculate my actual spring constants, and then you can see when I get down here to the let me point out one of the reasons I'm interested in it, aside from it being a possible indicator of running economy, is it's reported to be speed independent, where things like ground contact time, another potential determinant of your running economy, do vary with your speed, with your stride rate, etc. Whereas the spring constant seems to be something that is speed independent. So if you're looking for being able to compare different runs, that's convenient because you don't necessarily have to match them perfectly for speed. So you can sit here and see my K apparent. It's pretty flat, even though I'm running uphill and downhill and my pace was varying. And then down here are the averages for all of these. Interestingly, just in the last 2 weeks, a couple papers have appeared reporting spring constants from biomechanical studies of younger and older distance runners. And I've also seen some elite marathon data as well. My spring constant here is about half of what a experienced runner's spring constant would be, which is consistent with the fact that I know historically I consume lots and lots of extra oxygen. So at that point, one little quick chart, and then we deal with some questions here. Comment Steve McGregor made to me the other day was about his rolling or about normalized graded pace, and he's saying, well, if you think about it, that's really running power, right? You're taking into consideration uphill and downhill, etc. And I was like, you're right. And then I said, well, that'd be interesting to look at in WKO4 to see how they compare. Normalized graded pace is a calculation that's out there. Rolling normalized graded pace is, traveling it, following it across time. In order to, of course, pace and speed are independent. When your power is high, your pace would be low, and that is, it would take you less time to travel a particular distance. Now you can invert the y-axis to make it go the same direction, but what I did is I converted rolling normalized graded pace into speed, and just plotted it at the same time as power, which I had smoothed using a exponentially weighted moving average because this is smoothed. But what you find is pretty much the yellow and purple lines parallel each other. The only time there seems to be a bigger offset than elsewhere is on this downhill from this point to this point, in which case it seems that the rolling normalized graded pace algorithm seems to be giving gravity more credit for traveling down this hill than what the power meter might be doing. But nonetheless, they match up pretty well. So if you don't have a stride power meter, you can still dip into WKO4 and utilize things like this and gain significant insight into your own running. So at this point, let's see if we can deal with some of the questions. And I'm just going to, once Tim's out there, and maybe answered some of them, but yes, he already has.
I did start just typing one or two because they were really software questions, but it'd be great if you can.
All right. Karen Mackin, it's not a question, a key point. Oh yeah, that is a good point. I mean, because you have power data for running, if you have a stride or an RPM2, the normalized power algorithm applies. So you can use the normalized power idea as well to try and look at the data. And Karen's saying here that she's had success in applying that idea to variable workouts like hill repeats or track workouts. I tend to think of runners as running at a fairly steady pace till I actually went out and ran up and down these hills. And so I've been looking at what would be VI, right, variability index. I've noticed that my normalized power for running is 10% higher than my average power for the hills that I run up and down. So even though I don't have a lot of short-term quote-unquote stochasticity like you would in a criterion, or some people have worn stride while playing soccer, the data aren't as variable as that. They are variable enough that the normalized algorithm sort of kicks in and gives you additional credit and insight. So it seems that there's really only one currently unanswered question here. Does WKO use power to calculate EF by default for running, or does it use normalized graded pace as it had before running power came along? And that's a question that I don't know the answer to. However, if you want to, efficiency factor is it's power to heart rate ratio, right?
Yeah, Andy, it's normalized power.
So if you want to guarantee, you can calculate it yourself. Let's see. Oh, I didn't want to do that. So here is the horizontal running pack default. Oh, that's rowing. Oops. Sorry. I did not row down the street. It doesn't work that way. We'll search for anything that has EF. We'll get the default. Horizontal running pack default. There we go. All right. So does this give you efficiency factor? No, it doesn't. Oh, here we go. Running heart rate review chart. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hide that Explorer. I'm going to hide that Explorer. I'm going to take this up. So now we're just in here to something that we know has efficiency factor, EF. It's not giving us a value though, is it? So I'm at a bit of a loss as to why
Andy, click for lines.
none annotated. We should have a value, but let's just turn it into a line. All right. One of the tricks in WKO4, if you're trying to troubleshoot a chart, is many times flipping it to a report can help you figure out what's going on to see if it's something you've done wrong or if there's a bug in a chart or thereabouts. Another thing to think about with WKO4 or to help you troubleshoot is that WKO4, the way Kevin has designed it, is an amazingly powerful tool. If it can't answer a question, it will not tell you anything. And you may have seen the error messages, along the lines of, there's no data to be displayed or something like that in a particular range. But sometimes those don't get caught. So EF doesn't seem to be evaluating in this chart. I was looking to see if it was down there at the bottom. What I wanted to do is I wanted to compare EF as a default against trying to do write the expression from scratch myself and see if I got the same number that would answer the question about whether or not it's using power or graded pace. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to say I don't know. But you don't see EF showing up here, so it's not evaluating.
Yeah, Andy. So the formula for
Tim, you're out there? Maybe you know?
Yeah, so the formula for EF for cycling is normalized power divided by heart rate,
All right.
and you just have to use the formula for running. We didn't check it down to normalized graded pace. When we put it in charts, we just do the formula.
Well, if we have answered everyone's questions for tonight, then I guess at this point, I'll thank you all for your attention, and I will try and dig in and find an answer about how EF is calculated. And if anybody has other questions, my email is acoggin@earthlink.net. So feel free to send them my way, and I'll do my best to answer them. Everybody have a good evening.
Thanks, Andy. Good night, everyone.